certainly. And I think what would be a good teaser for near the end of the show is I'd be more than happy to dissect the last poll that I had done for the Angele Davis campaign,
Sure.
but no sense in starting off with that. I'll make people wait. But what happened this weekend, first off, there was very low turnout. I would say it is probably the worst I have ever seen for a statewide race, and that's going as far back as the last time I remember a turnout this low, when it was still in the 20s, was the 2006 special elections for Secretary of State and for Insurance Commissioner. That was held in September 2006. I want to say statewide turnout was in the low 20s. Back after the December 2016 runoffs, the big surprise, in my opinion, was that statewide turnout for a federal election was 29.5%. That was bad. And so the thought was amongst the political crowd, given that we knew back in December and January there was going to be special elections this October, what was the turnout going to be? And so you had all kinds of guessing games going on. And I will admit to you that even being pessimistic, I assumed 20%, because I figured if a federal election could only get us 29.5%, it certainly was not going to go above that for a down ballot race. Well, lo and behold, I got religion, so to speak, when the early voting started to happen, and the numbers were just downright awful relative to the Senate race. I started ratcheting down my estimates down to 15 and then down to the 10 to 15 range. It ended up being 13% half statewide. And the thing that was interesting was that 13.5% was artificially bolstered by the fact that you had New Orleans mayor's race, and of course you had the city council races and other parish-wide races in Orleans, resulting in New Orleans having a disproportionate impact relative to prior election cycles. More specifically, Orleans Parish is typically about 8 to 10% of the statewide vote. Saturday night, it was nearly 20%, which I've not seen before. So given that you had the backdrop of low turnout, believe it or not, it did not really impact the results that much, other than to add a point or two to Derrick Edwards' margin, because, of course, he overwhelmingly carried Orleans Parish like I thought he would. Now, coming in second place, John Schroder eked out a 9,500 vote victory over Angele Davis, and then Neil Reiser finished fourth, and then you had two other candidates who together got about 5%. The thing that I think is interesting when you're dissecting those top four candidates was how the specific areas of strengths and weaknesses amongst the four. Derrick Edwards, I never doubted for a minute would make the runoff because, of course, he had, number one, the Democratic Party label, and he was the only Democrat. Number two, this is not the kind of thing I'm allowed to say, but I'll say it anyway, because he had the last name of Edwards, I think that that's the kind of name that some people are going to see it on the ballot. Some may be thinking they're voting for Edwin. Some may be thinking they're voting for John Bell. But point being is, being a Democrat and having a last name of Edwards, I would argue to a Democratic primary base is an asset. And so, of course, my polling always showed that Derrick Edwards was in the lead, and that, in fact, is what happened. He coalesced the black vote, getting about 75%, not only statewide, but more specifically in Orleans Parish. That's a point I'm going to come back to in a few minutes. So Derrick Edwards basically got the Democratic base vote. He also got about 15% of the white vote. In Orleans Parish, that 15% was more like 35%, which, again, given that Orleans has a more liberal electorate across the board, not particularly surprising there. So Derrick Edwards started off with the Democratic base, and that, in fact, is what he ended up with when he won, took first place finish in a statewide race. What John Schroder did, I would say, first off, congratulations to him for running a good campaign. But more specifically, John Schroder, I would say there was one word that characterized his campaign from start to finish. That one word is dominance. By dominance, what I'm referring to is that John Schroder started off early, and he had an incredible amount of self-discipline in terms of raising money as far back in my memory as January, and steadily lining up the endorsements, building up an impressive war chest that enabled him to dominate the airwaves in the month of September. So from that standpoint, which is the self-discipline that enables you to amass a huge war chest, considering that not many people wanted to give to a down ballot race this year, you have to give him credit where it's due, that he did what it took to win. He had the dominance across the state, more specifically in the New Orleans suburbs, and that dominance enabled him to eke out a 9,500 vote margin over Angele Davis. Her strength was more in Baton Rouge and Southwest Louisiana. And Neil Reiser, he was very much a local candidate, which gave him a good head start. Unfortunately, North Louisiana does not cast a particularly large proportion of the vote to begin with. And when you have the dominance of Orleans Parish, that not particularly large portion of the vote is even less. So Neil Reiser had a very strong base in Northeast Louisiana and to a lesser extent in Northwest and Central Louisiana. He was never really able to break out of that, unfortunately. And one of the things he did, which me personally, I thought it was unwise, but he did it, was he invested a lot of resources in New Orleans, more specifically with those black voter groups. The irony to that approach was when I crunched the numbers, Neil Reiser got about 8% of the black vote in New Orleans, which not only is what Angele Davis got spending no money in that community, but the fact was he actually did better with white voters in New Orleans than he did with black voters. And I just think New Orleans is too overwhelmingly Democratic of a city for a Republican to make a serious effort to compete there. And that the efforts that were expended in trying to get the vote that, in my opinion, was never his to begin with, could have been better used getting additional support in Shreveport or Lake Charles or Lafayette, maybe even Baton Rouge if you're thinking about some of the more rural areas at the outskirts.